Now, it gives me great pleasure to introduce my colleague, Dr. Philip Blair, who's a medical doctor, a retired colonel in the US Army. He's trained as a family physician, and he served as a combat physician in the Gulf War, and he's retired after 29 years in uniform. So he manages very complex diseases, and since 2014 has been treating, consulting, lecturing, in particular on cannabidiol, the non-intoxicating component of cannabis that I mentioned before. So Philip's here at the moment doing, I guess, a bit of a tour around Australia where we're running courses for doctors on medicinal cannabis. So welcome.
What's a good boy like me doing in this industry? Now, I've got to ask myself that exact question because if you look at my history, I started off and went to the United States Military Academy. I was trained as a soldier. And then I went to the University of Miami School of Medicine. I trained in family practice. And then I served in the services as a combat physician in some roles in the Gulf War and finished my career in 1997 in that particular area. Now, part of my duties were actually to detect people who were using cannabis. And by God, I've gotten on the other side of that, and which is quite amazing for me. So, and I think that I had bought into the story that this substance had no particular value whatsoever. But having looked at the evidence and seen what was the science on it, I realized that I was grossly mistaken, and I had been misled by so many people along the way. So this is such a profound topic that it is going to turn the medical industry on its head, that we are looking at an entirely different paradigm on how the body works, the mechanisms that are in play, and what this entire system, the endocannabinoid system, can do for us. There's opportunities for actually using this system as a target for modern therapy and addressing, as we have been doing with much of integrative medicine. So much of the targets for things like acupuncture, for osteopathic type of manipulation, for diet, exercise, are actually using this endocannabinoid system to modulate it and restore health in so many individuals. As Kylie talked about, this system is really designed for maintaining our health and balance. When it gets out of balance, that's when we can use these other therapeutic modalities, including phytocannabinoids, in order to modify this to restore us and give us the allowance to get back to health. So what is cannabidiol? I look at it as a natural food oil, and it's known for healing. It signals the cells of the body. It is what I call the software of our cellular system and how things work intracellularly and intercellularly. So between cells and within the cells, the operation modality of those cells is based much on the endocannabinoid system being involved, and part of its duties here is to maintain a balance within that cellular system. Now, what Kylie showed you earlier, that retrograde balancing occurs at the nerve junctions, but I'm going to focus a lot in the inflammatory role actually on what's happening on the cells, inside the cells, right down to the mitochondria, right down to the nucleus of the cell. Now, CBD can be taken orally or applied to the skin or vaporized. They're all effective. Now, the beauty of vaporization, and that's why I'm really enthusiastic about it, is that goes into the lungs, enters the bloodstream, and the next place for that blood to go is the brain and the eye. And so you deliver in milliseconds the cannabinoids right to the brain and those vital structures, so that microdoses of cannabidiol actually are delivered to the brain to modulate some of those nerve interactions. Hemp is absolutely safe, and I know because my practice has been an international practice in 43 countries of the world, and my clients hail from South Africa, UK, Sweden, Japan, Korea, many different countries, and I've had the privilege of working with so many. And that's one of the, that's the exciting part for me, is that after looking at the evidence for cannabinoids and cannabidiol in particular, I realized that there was a vast amount of literature that was already there, and the indications and the potential was truly astounding. So I started digging into the literature and exploring the real potential for what cannabidiol could offer humans as an entire race, and the impact that it would have. And I can tell you that I continue to be thoroughly amazed by the detail and the mechanism and the benevolence of this particular molecule. So we talked a little bit about the difference between the subspecies that go on. Frankly, all of the hemp and marijuana is the same genus and species, and there are just slight variations that occur in it. And we really can't identify any particular strain anymore. It is really all blended together as a result of cross integration with these particular plants. But essentially, the legal definition is that hemp doesn't contain very much THC, less than 0.2 or 0.3 in the United States, and that marijuana contains high amounts of THC, and that certainly is quite variable in what's available. We have the basic concept that this is a lock and key mechanism, that the phytocannabinoids and the endocannabinoids connect up with receptors, turn that lock, and open up that particular action. But what we're actually finding out is much, much broader and much more extensive, that these receptors are inside the cell, they are on the cell surface, and they are on the nucleus, they are actually on the mitochondria, and that's why this system is so broad in its cascading of different actions within the cellular environment. It changes how enzymes work within the cellular system. It changes how some of these substances that cells produce are released to other cells and across membranes. It changes how ions flow within the cell, actually opening up ion channels, which is a key area for things like epilepsy. It also it changes how other keys work. So that concept of that one key fitting into one lock is now, that lock now has 3 or 4 different keyholes, and this particular substance can fit into any one of those particular keyholes and change the way those receptors act, how vigorously they react, and how many changes occur with them. So there's a great deal of mixing and matching that's occurring with this particular system. I want to get across the concept that the endocannabinoid system is a cell signaling system. So between cells, inside cells, that we're making changes in the mechanics and the function of that cell, and also the individual organelles that are inside the cell, whether that's mitochondria or the Golgi apparatus or the endoplasmic reticulum. Subtle changes are actually occurring in those particular organelle systems that the cannabidiol and the endocannabinoid system are working on. Now, these particular systems, we get into trouble when we are under stress by either our sleeplessness, toxins, different types of infective illnesses, and they all make changes in how the endocannabinoid system works. So it could throw us out of balance, and with being thrown out of balance, then we enter a state of disease or chronic disease, or even autoimmune type of phenomena. So the story about the endocannabinoid system actually goes back in the history of our world about 600 million years. It's a very, very old story. But about 500 million years ago, animals figured out how to work with this. And the first animal that was identified with a complete endocannabinoid system with receptors as well as ligands to function on the body, the hydra, was identified. A lot of the food that we eat is actually most attractive because it contains endocannabinoid stimulating substances. Truffles, one of the most valuable foods on the planet, are actually producing anandamide, which is a stimulus for our system, which gives an explanation for why people have such a passion for truffles. Our sleep is regulated by this particular system, and it's the control. Breastfeeding is vital. The endocannabinoid system is vital for breastfeeding, for the suckling reflex, for the stimulation of the child to take to the breast and the nipple. Has anyone ever seen a child who is looking for that nipple, trying to find out where that is vigorously finding it, grabs a hold of that nipple, starts sucking on it, eyes roll back in the head, ecstasy, cannabinoids. Exercise. We used to think that exercise, it was endorphins that were being released into the brain that gave us the high of running. But in fact, it actually turns out that these are cannabinoids, endocannabinoids that are being released that are providing that ecstasy and the analgesia that allows runners and athletes to continue in spite of pain and discomfort. So when we're under a great deal of stress, that there's a body's reaction there is to make changes within the endocannabinoid system, those immediate changes. That's fine. The body reacts. Changes are made in the body that are functional, that stimulate particular action for recovery and muscle generation, for different systems to react, certainly energy and such. But we also are in the mode, after that acute event has occurred, we need to transition to that cellular system out of that stress and go into the recovery mode. And that's the delayed mode, and that's a healthy endocannabinoid system response. And so the body turns on the endocannabinoids to release these substances, to join with the available receptors, and increase different mediators and in the body and these systems in order to recover and restore and terminate the stress response. Unfortunately, in many cases, what we're left with is, if we don't have a healthy endocannabinoid system, we end up with a chronic state, a disease state, or an illness going on. So how does cannabidiol affect the endocannabinoid system? Now, marvelously, this adaptogenic molecule is able to help restore the endocannabinoid system back to balance. CBD makes more ligands available, it balances the enzymes and the receptors, and it restores the proper functioning to the endocannabinoid system. So it's an upregulator of the entire system to help to restore it to normalcy. Now, Kylie talked about the breadth of this particular substance, this adaptogenic molecule, on all different systems. I've listed off many of them here, but tonight I want to focus on the immune system and the controlling of immune cells and inflammation as a targeted area, and I've got a couple case studies that I want to relate from my patients. You know, over the last 5.5 years, I've treated well over 3,000 patients with cannabinoids. And I'm so pleased that they've had such wonderful results with it. I've gathered a lot of personal experience in how to use cannabinoids, and that's what I came here to Australia to impart to other professionals about how they can use these cannabinoids to great benefit for the patients in a broad range of different conditions. So let's talk about the immune system, because probably the final common pathway for so many of the illnesses that we encounter are immune inflammatory difficulties. So one of the first areas that CBD has effect on is actually the cell population. It actually helps regulate the balance between attack cells that are dealing with inflammation, illness, and invasion, and it shifts them over to a more benign nature for a regulatory pattern of cellular type. So it reduces those inflammatory type of cells that are being produced. In addition, it's changing how those immune cells work. White blood cells migrate to an area of injury, inflammation, or infection, and they create an inflamed response. Initially, that inflamed response is healthy. It brings in defenders of the body for infections and other problems to initiate the healing process. But then if that stays too long, then it becomes diseased, or chronically inflamed, and we're left with great deals of inflammation. What cannabidiol has ability to do is actually change the migration effect, turn off the migration of those particular immune cells into the inflamed area, actually reduce the way that they get into those particular tissues as they migrate through some of the barriers. It also prevents the rolling of these particular cells along along the endothelium, for example, for things like atherosclerosis. And the third major way for CBD actually affecting inflammation has to do with blocking the release of inflammatory cytokines. But marvelously, the balancing act is to increase the number of anti-inflammatory cytokines that are being released. So it's modulating all three aspects of the immune cells. Even though it's doing this, you might consider this, well, isn't it going to be immunosuppressive? But in fact, it does not reduce our abilities of the body to react to infection. And there's been no increase in infection as a result of using CBD. So what conditions can we help with using CBD? I'm going to talk about pain, inflammatory bowel, and Parkinson's in just 3 case studies that I'll go through briefly. So this is a 45-year-old woman I met at a integrated medicine mental health conference in Dallas a few years ago. She came to me in a wheelchair and with this history of 7 years being wheelchair bound with chronic excruciating pain on one side of her body where even the blowing of the air conditioning would set off terrific spasms of pain. This is chronic regional pain syndrome. Very, very challenging. We don't have any good treatments, and certainly the medications that she was using had not been able to completely control. Her life was much of a mess, totally on hold. She wasn't able to manage much of anything except trying to relieve some of the spasms of pain that she experienced. I had the opportunity to help her and use her first doses of cannabidiol when she came up to the booth where I was standing. So let me tell you a little bit about CRPS, that it is often trauma-related to, and it's related to some of the cytokine release that is dysfunctional, to say the least. It's an exaggerated neurogenic type of inflammation that occurs in the area. Now, any type of inflammation is both locally for inflammatory cells as well as neurogenic. As things like osteoarthritis also has a neurologic component that we haven't really appreciated until now. There's a sympathetic coupling that goes along with this, so that a sympathetic type of response that is occurring as well as our nerve sensory. There are glial cells that are involved with part of the inflammation that is actually going on in neurologic areas like the spinal cord or the brain. And there is a cortical reorganization going on in the brain. So the brain is actually reorganizing because of this chronic pain symptoms. And in addition, we have oxidative damage going on in some of the nerve cells in different regions of the brain as well as peripherally. So I started off with 30 milligrams of a concentration of cannabidiol that had a high amount of CBD and a low amount of THC. And over the period of time, in the next few minutes, I watched the changes that occurred. She had a decreased pain level within 5 minutes. It was a modest level, and that was very satisfying, and she was very pleased at that. Well, she went away and took a nap and came back later. About 3 hours later, instead of being in a wheelchair, she was walking down the aisle to say hello to me. and to thank me for introducing her to the cannabidiol. She was buoyant in mood, she was social, she was energized, and I think you get an idea from this picture how joyful she was about having had this experience. Now that was sustained, and she continued to have those kinds of benefits. And she was using doses about 3 times a day to help control the symptoms she was having, and she was recovering much of her ability in her life. Now, the mechanism that's involved with this appears to have something to do with some of these ion channels that I spoke to earlier, that the CBD is actually regulating ion channels. This is not part of the endocannabinoid system, but one of the other targets that's available for CBD. This particular pain syndromes have also been identified using this particular channel. So innovatively, we're discovering new and amazing connections that CBD offers for other diseases for which we had no cure or response for. Even things like cystic fibrosis that has issues with particular ion channels can be benefited by using CBD. The next case I want to present is inflammatory bowel disease. And this is a 47-year-old licensed radiation therapy who's divorced and 3 sons. She's devoted to animal rescue. And she developed bloody diarrhea and a loss of bowel control, and she was requiring diapers. She had exhaustion and fatigue. She was unable to walk her dogs and her activity. She had trials of prednisone and ciprofloxacin and an antibiotic, but they failed, and they weren't really controlling anything. She tried many different diets, again, a failure, and she was unable to maintain employment. She couldn't continue to work and have fecal incontinence. And a CT scan at the time showed thickening of her sigmoid, so that was fairly diagnostic. But she did need to have a colonoscopy. However, in the inflamed state, she was not a candidate for doing any type of endoscopy. It turns out that in inflammatory bowel disease, we actually have a brain, gut, and connection that is regulated and controlled by the endocannabinoid system. It's intimately involved in inflammation at the membrane level, the lining of the intestines, going to the nerve complexes that are in the GI tract, as well as going back to the brain. And that these signals, whether they come from bacteria in the gut or from inflammation that's occurring in the gut, are going back and forth. In fact, the gut is actually considered to have more neurotransmitters than the brain based on volume. So their neurotransmitters are similar, and the cannabinoid receptors are actually more plentiful in the gut area. So it only makes sense that cannabinoids could regulate this very much important part of our illness. Well, cannabinoids in inflammatory bowel disease can work in a number of different ways. Looking at inflammation, we know that inflammatory cytokines increase the permeability of the lining of the intestines, and that results in protein molecules passing through the membrane and the lining such that it creates immune response and reaction and causes additional inflammation. THC and CBD actually inhibited that increase in permeability, and that was associated with inflammation. And these substances, these phytocannabinoids, were able to ameliorate the cytokine inflammation effect on permeability. In addition, the cannabinoids were able to accelerate recovery from this particular problem. So we have this permeability as well as the inflammatory issues that are occurring in the gut that can be corrected by using cannabinoids. Now, the patient initiated a 30 milligram per milliliter high CBD, low THC tincture. She started on a dose of 15 milligrams twice a day, increasing to 30 milligrams twice a day. She made dietary changes in her specific carbohydrate diet. She reduced her stressful environment, and she began meditating and with yoga. I certainly believe in a balanced approach and an integrative approach to patient care. Cannabinoids are not a magic bullet. We need to combine them with whole person type of therapy, and whether that's counseling, that's exercise, that's diet, that's meditation, all of those things really work together, as well as acupuncture and massage and all of the things we know are entirely beneficial. So within 7 days, her symptoms began to subside, and after 6 weeks, the colonoscopy showed only microscopic changes in her inflammation. 3 months later, she sent me pictures of her climbing a mountain after that in Colorado, so she was at high altitude as well. Excellent recovery and response, and she's continued to do well. So the third case is neurodegeneration and Parkinson's disease. This was a 67-year-old man with 5 years of progressive Parkinson's disease symptoms, including tremor, balance issues, chronic shoulder pain, as well as a shuffling gait, decreased facial expression, and his medications include the usual that were associated with trying to mask the symptoms and control the adverse effects associated with Parkinson's disease. The current treatment was really not able to control the tremor. Patients suffered greatly from these particular problems. We know that, in fact, in Parkinson's disease, there are a number of different pathways of disease, from these particular deposits that are unfolded or misfolded proteins called Lewy bodies that occur within neurons, and particularly the dopamine type of generating neurons in the basal ganglia. We know that there are mitochondrial dysfunction and reductions in the mitochondria that are available. And down to the oxidative individual cells, we see oxidative stress for a release of reactive oxygen species inside the cell that leads to damage and destruction and cell death within this particular group. In addition, a very interesting area is the area of exosomes, and that is how some of the cells actually transmit some of these unfolded or misfolded proteins to other cells and actually perpetuate the disease. A very interesting study showed that some of these misfolded proteins occurring in the gut would actually migrate by the vagal nerve, the afferent branches, to the brain and seem to be precipitating some disease in some individual. And exosomes seem to be part of that, the way that these bubbles of substances were released from the cell to be taken up by other cells. Well, cannabidiol blocks the CB1 receptor, the TRPV1 receptors that are related to pain, and the GPR55 is one of the cannabinoid receptors that we've identified as being key in pain as well as the problems associated with Parkinson's. Now, cannabinoid type 2 receptor is one that is mainly for immune, and CBD is actually stimulating this receptor and helping our bodies to function more clearly. Now, interestingly, CBD has, of course, the anti-inflammatory effects. It's actually much more anti-inflammatory than vitamin C and vitamin E. And it increases the number of mitochondria that the body produces, actually stimulating the production and the numbers of mitochondria in the cells. It blocks those exosomes, those releases of particles that could be infectious to other nerve cells. And it stabilizes the blood-brain barrier. Now, the blood-brain barrier is designed so it's going to inhibit any type of irritating substance into the brain area and the eye area. But in the face of certain types of neurodegenerative diseases, there is actually a breakdown and there's leakage into that region, and it leads to further inflammation of the brain. CBD has the ability to block that restore that membrane strength, just like it restores the resistance of the gut from the increased permeability from inflammation. So the initial therapy we started with was just 5 milligrams of a liposomal form of CBD, and this was taken sublingually. Within 5 minutes, the tremor subsided, and his voice decreased in octave, dropped in octave, and increased in volume. The patient was able to join a fishing party later on in the day on a rocking boat and had a successful outing without any type of impairment. He continued the therapy using it twice a day and had really an excellent response. I fully believe, and I think the evidence is going to show, that this will stop the progression of this disease as well as the prevention of the tremor and many of the adverse effects associated with it. I asked him to also add a terpene that is also considered a cannabinoid, beta-caryophyllene, and this was successfully applied twice a day, has a stabilizing effect on all of our neurodegenerative types of conditions. It's also, I recommended that he start a taper of his DOPA medication and in collaboration with his PCP. So how do I use cannabidiol in patients? First off, I'm looking for a full spectrum type of product that contains a balance of the endocannabinoids, the phytocannabinoids, as well as terpenes, the flavonoids, and all of the whole plant goodness that is there from the hemp plant. The isolate products are definitely have gained attention, and they've led us to this threshold of opening up the real value of the cannabinoids. But isolates are just like medications in that they require, they have one particular action. They're fairly limited. Unfortunately, they're not as effective per dose. They require much more of a dose of CBD, so you're using a much higher milligram. They have other side effects and adversity that is associated with them as well, and they don't perform nearly as beneficial. So isolates tend to require very large doses versus the full spectrum requiring relatively minor dosages. The use of CBD can be used by orally, it can be sublingual, topically, it can be vaporized. All of these have beneficial ways. Now, for most patients, I recommend, because people respond to CBD in different ways, I recommend people starting with a standard serving that's on the bottle and then making adjustments from there. If you're over 70 or under 7, then start with half a dose, or particularly sensitive to medications of any type, then start with a lower dose, even to the point of starting with a topical, and experimenting to find out how you're going to react. You'd like to be able to say that it's based on weight, but that has not borne out in most of my experience. The duration of action is 6 to 12 hours, but this is not a standard medication. And what I mean is that we're using the signaling properties of cannabidiol, not drug levels, in order to achieve the benefits and the cell signaling inside the cell. So drug levels are not required. We want to, in most cases, and we want to signal the body cells and the endocannabinoid system to restore and rebalance them. What kind of changes can people expect to see using CBD? Now, what I love to do is have people sample CBD right in front of me, or if I'm on the telephone, if they're a long distance away. And I want to listen to their voice. I want to run down a number of parameters, have them self-assess, and then see what kind of things change. And these are the types of things that I see within just a few minutes of a high-quality CBD that is used for an individual. Quite an extraordinary response. It doesn't take a long time. This is when people are taking it sublingually, and you get the response within a few minutes after using it. What about the bad effects of CBD? Well, there's no tolerance, there's no addiction. In fact, for the most part, I see doses being reduced after about 4 to 6 weeks so that people can actually decrease the amount of CBD that they're using and still maintain the benefits. Probably, my concept is that's a restoration of the endocannabinoid system so that it's now much more functional and much more responsive to maintain health. There's no toxicity. Now, studies that you've read about have to do with isolate type of CBD used in massive doses where, yes, you can have liver inflammation. But remember, those doses are on the order of 20 to 50 milligrams per kilogram, and the standard dosing for these products is on the order of 0.2 milligrams per kilogram. So worlds apart, and toxicity is not occurring, and drug interactions are not occurring at these very, very low doses that I'm recommending and that we're seeing with a product like this. There are very rare types of adverse reactions that I've seen in treating well over 3,000 patients. Effectively no drug interactions at these small doses are occurring. Yes, again, there's a potential for drug interactions when you get up to much higher levels. And there's no coagulation effect. In other words, it's not going to interfere with any of our anticoagulants, again, at normal dosage ranges. So I just want to wrap it up at this point, and really we'll want to pass it back to Kylie and give some more of our interaction, and we'll be able to answer some more questions in a few minutes.